All right, so this is part 2 on this lecture series about the links between pornography and sexual violence in the context of intimate partner violence. We will look more on the links between sexual abuse of individuals who are not in committed relationships a little bit later in the semester when we do our sexual violence unit. But this is focusing primarily on those who are actually in a romantic coupling, that this is a sexual assault of a romantic partner, of an intimate partner. So we talked in the first video about what are some of the reasons that there might be a relationship between pornography and sexual violence, sexual abuse of a partner. So if you missed that, make sure to go back to part 1. But so this second part of this lecture series is going to focus on what does this relationship actually look like? What are some of the numbers we have? What are some of the statistics that we have? One thing that we know is this relationship actually starts pretty early on. There have been studies that have specifically focused on teenage boys in high school and how their viewing of pornography impacts their dating practice, their sexual interactions with somebody that they're dating. One study actually found that teenage boys who had watched violent pornography, which, remember, there's a whole lot of ways we could define if it's violent or not, and a lot of them actually aren't nonviolent if you begin incorporating issues like ignoring consent and them saying no and being overpowered anyway and things of that nature. But teenage boys who had watched violent pornography were 2 to 3 times more likely to be perpetuator or to be perpetrators in a teen dating violence situation. And within that study, the average age of the participants was about 10th grade. So even in high school, even among teenagers, before this has been something of, well, I've been a porn addict for 15 years, like even early on as this is happening, the exposure to violent pornography is leading to a significant increase, 2 to 3 times more likely, of being a perpetrator of dating violence in a teen relationship. Another interesting study found that even if they didn't do something that might cross the line into dating violence, that teen boys who were watching pornography and who were sexually active were more insistent on having an overtly dominant role in those sexual encounters, and that they tended to be more emotionally distant from their partner within those sexual encounters. So basically, instead of their first experiences with sexuality being something that was mutually respectful and the goal was there would be, shared consent and mutual pleasure and all this, the focus was on them wanting to be overtly dominant. And that emotional connection that, you hope people have as part of their first sexual experience really was kind of lacking. And the link there was their pornography exposure during their teenage years. And this is something that we see moving all the way through adulthood. There was actually a really interesting meta-analysis done, which a meta-analysis, if you're not familiar, is a study that instead of collecting its own, like handing out surveys to its own participants and collecting its own studies, what a meta-analysis does is it looks at published studies on the topic and aggregates all of the data from all those studies to put it together into kind of one big, okay, so if we combine all this, what does it mean? And there's been a lot of meta-analysis on the link between pornography and sexual abuse because we have so many studies about those out there. But a pretty recent meta-analysis of over 20 studies found that there was consistent and clear evidence that pornography consumption, even nonviolent pornography consumption, was related to increased incidence of both physical sexual aggression among partners and also verbal sexual aggression among partners. And this would be like that non-physical coercion or, just absolutely kind of verbally bashing someone to get to agree for what you're wanting to do. And within that meta-analysis, even though they focused primarily on those non-violent studies, because, violent porn is a whole separate issue. If you're intentionally seeking out media that's about rape or that's about revenge porn or things like that, that's a separate issue. Still linked, but I would like to do some content on that later this semester, and I hope that I am able to get to that. But anyway, so even though this focused mostly on those who were claiming that it was nonviolent pornography, one thing that they did find in their studies is that this relationship was there even with nonviolent porn. But those who brought in violent pornography into the mix showed that the violent pornography was an even further exacerbating factor, meaning this relationship exists even if they're claiming they're watching nonviolent porn. But for those who are watching violent porn, it's even worse. The relationship is stronger. It's more intense. There was another meta-analysis that was done recently that found that exposure to sexually explicit media, even if it's not sexually violent, was a significant risk factor for both dating violence that was not sexual in nature, but also for sexual violence. So it's not just that sexual violence breeds sexual violence, it's that sexual violence can kind of generalize itself to interpartner violence as a bigger picture as well. And then there was a really interesting research study done by the Journal of Violence Against Women. And one thing that they found was that men who used pornography had higher rates of being found guilty of sexual abuse, of stalking, and of marital rape than those who were not pornography users. And for the argument of 100% of men use pornography, those who say they don't are lying, that's not true. That's something that men with a porn problem say to make themselves feel better. It is not true that all men view pornography. So, and that's how we're able to have some of these comparisons in some of these studies. So men who use pornography were found to engage in higher rates of sexual abuse, of stalking, and of marital rape than those who did not view pornography. Now, where this gets really interesting is when you start looking at partners together, when you start looking at studies where they're talking to the victim partner and the perpetrator partner. There was a really interesting study done among sexually abused women that over half of the women, it was actually close to 60% of the women in the study, had said that their perception was that their husband's pornography use affected their husband's abuse of them. The type of abuse, the content of the abuse, the frequency of the abuse, the pattern of the abuse. About 60% of women who had been abused felt like their husband's pornography usage was a significant influencer in their abuse. And one study that was really interesting found researchers actually got couples together and they studied them for several months. They followed them for several months and they compared the rates of domestic violence that were documented at baseline at the beginning of the study with the rates of the domestic violence that were documented at the end of the study. And they compared and this was specifically on heterosexual couples, and they compared the male's response with the female's response about their interpartner violence. And one of the things that was found in this study is that a higher frequency of porn use among the men over the duration of the study resulted in a significant increase in the rate of perpetuation of intimate partner violence over the duration of the study. Meaning, if you compare what is the rate of abuse over here at time 1 and how much has that rate of abuse increased over time 2, one of the explanations that was found for this increase was how much porn was being used by the male partner in this time period. More porn use equaled a greater increase in rates of intimate partner violence. And that's one of the few studies that's been done longitudinally, asking couples questions in real time over several months and comparing their answers and following them. And like I said, I'll make sure I provide links to all these studies in the comments. But one of the common arguments that comes up when you discuss this is, okay, well, you keep saying exposure to violent pornography. What if I just stick to the nonviolent stuff? Which again, in video 1, we talked about how that'd be pretty hard to do because most pornography in some way does show violence towards women or the overriding of the consent of the female partner. But even if someone was on a mission to, I want the more erotica type stuff. I want to see couples who are engaging in respectful and mutual satisfying sexual interactions. I'm going to skip all the violent stuff. Here's what I'm going to look for. That seems like a great goal if you're bound and determined to watch pornography. However, it doesn't work that way. Because if you remember what we talked about in the first video about some of the theories for why this is happening, and one of them being kind of that wearing down of the pleasure pathway of the brain where it gets less and less responsive, that makes this a difficult thing to try to do. There was one study that found that about half of male participants, after they had been using porn for a while, they acknowledged that they had begun seeking out materials about interactions that they would have previously been uninterested in, or they acknowledged that they previously would have even been disgusted by. So those videos that are overtly showing rape and abuse and revenge and whatever else you want to kind of wrap into that package, the things that they, when they first started watching porn, that they would have said, no, I'm disgusted by that stuff. I don't want to watch that. That's not my thing. Over half of them admitted, after I had been watching it for a while, my opinion changed, and that's what I was looking for. And again, that's only those who admitted it. This wasn't something that they were able to like factually compare their search history. So if half of them admitted it, we could wager a guess that probably a little more than half would that statement be true for. But again, this kind of validates that research we talked about in part one, that what's happening is the pleasure response is being numbed. The reward system is being worn out, and increasingly stimulating stimuli is being required. And that also fits really well with the research that we know that there's a relationship between increased erectile dysfunction among men who use porn, and there's a reduced rate of sexual satisfaction with your real life sexual partner the more porn you use, because your real life partner cannot keep up with all these videos that you're watching. And what that breeds is a reduced sexual satisfaction. And if what you're seeking out is more and more extreme, and so what you're wanting for sexual satisfaction is things that are more and more violent, and you're not satisfied with your sexual partner anyway, because that effect has already taken hold in your brain, it's easy to see how this can very quickly snowball into a situation of the partner being the victim of sexual assault, of sexual abuse. And it does stand to reason that there's a difference in effect between violent and nonviolent pornography. But research has shown that even if we're looking specifically at nonviolent pornography, that there is a contribution towards an increase in sexually aggressive behavior. And then basically what violent pornography does is it adds to that effect. So the effect is there anyway, and the level of violence just kind of continues to pile more and more risk on top of this, for this being something that would actually be acted out in those relationships. And one thing that we've seen over the past few years is we have seen a huge increase in the rates of intimate partner rape that's reported by women. Part of that is societal. More women can say it and be believed. But we have seen a huge increase in the rates of intimate partner rape of women. And there are a lot of professionals that agree that the biggest common denominator in the rates of wives being raped going up is the consumption of pornography by the male offender, by the male partner. And it doesn't just end at the actual physical sexual assault of the partner. Other things that have been documented is an increase in the deprivation of liberties. So partners being controlling and intrusive, and you're not allowed to text, you're not allowed to talk on the phone. I have to go through your emails. I have to get access to your Facebook. So deprivation of liberties, an increase in overall physical liberties among physical injuries among intimate partners, an increased risk of torture, both psychological and physical, an increased risk of drugging among intimate partners, and finally, and this is a big one, an increase in rates of filming and sharing sexual footage without the partner's consent. Secretly filming, hidden camera, or really quick taking that picture while they're getting out of the shower, while they're changing clothes, while they're in the bathroom, whatever it might be. The amount of apps on phones that exist to do this now is absolutely disgusting. There are apps that exist on the phone, and I actually might drop links for apps to look for if you've ever been concerned about this. But there are apps that can exist on phones that basically what I could do is I could download this app on my phone, and I could prop my phone up over here. Like maybe I prop it up on a water bottle, or I prop it up against the cabinet. And I can put a motion sensor on it. And anytime that motion sensor is triggered, the screen will automatically start recording, but the screen will stay black. So it could be left in a bathroom, left in a closet, left on a nightstand. And it's things like that. We see an increase in that being used against romantic partners. That used to be the thing that we would hear about people doing in gas station bathrooms or in tanning salon or in skeezy rental houses or something like that. But these are things that we're now hearing about happening more and more often in intimate partner relationships. We've seen a huge increase in the filming and sharing of sexual footage without a partner's consent, and it's been termed revenge pornography, if you've ever heard of that. And for a long time, those branches of research were separate, and a lot of people would say, revenge porn is kind of a separate thing that's not really connected to domestic violence. It's not really connected to abusive relationships. But what we're starting to see is that these phenomena do overlap significantly. And as we see rates of partner rape going up, we're starting to see rates of these types of behaviors go up as well. And we're starting to see rates of that category of porn available on Pornhub and these other websites, this category of revenge porn and hidden camera porn. The popularity of that is going up. So again, we're conditioning this. We're conditioning this idea of this might be a fun thing to do with my partner. The sneakiness of this and the fact that I have these photos of them without them knowing, the sneakiness and the power trip, that sort of thing then becomes tied to the sexual arousal. And there was a really interesting write-up that was done by somebody who was from the law school at Miami. And one of the things that they had talked about was how much more seriously courts are starting to take, or how much more seriously courts should take. It was kind of a persuasion type piece, that the sharing of pictures, a lot of times wouldn't sound like domestic violence, but that this really is a serious thing, because the non-consensual filming and sharing of photos, one thing that research has found is the non-consensual filming and sharing of photos is actually becoming one of the most common ways to control and intimidate a partner in a relationship that has turned domestically violent. Because if you think about it, it's a major trump card. If you have somebody who is a professional in a field that speaks about issues that have social justice implications, or even look at celebrities, at how many of them have had sex tapes and photos and things turned against them. But if you have somebody who's a professional and would care very much about their image, should photos get out, should videos get out that they didn't even know existed, you've created a breeding ground for power and control. And as we know from what we've already talked about in this class, a lot of abuse originates with power and control. There's more on this topic to talk about the relationship that we found if we kind of go deeper in specifically looking at child pornography and simulated child pornography and incidences of child abuse. And I'm going to try to tie some of that in when we do our child sexual abuse chapter later on in the semester. But for now, that is some of the current state of the research as we have it on the relationship between the viewing of pornography and intimate partner violence. Please feel free to reach out, to email if you have any further questions on this topic. Like I said, this is kind of my soapbox. This is an area of both personal and professional advocacy. This is something I love to talk about. So I'm happy to answer any additional questions or even do any sort of follow-ups if there's a common question that keeps popping up.